Hello, welcome back. Professor Kleiman here, and today we're going to be talking about using sources in your writing and how to know when it's appropriate to quote, paraphrase, or summarize. So let's just start with how do you use research sources. Good writers don't just find sources and plug them in. They really take time to think about and make decisions on how they are going to use those sources. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. So the three most common ways to use a source in your writing is to use a direct quote, to paraphrase it, or to summarize it. And it's your job as a writer to know when each one works best. And what we're going to do in this short little lecture today is we're just going to go over when you might want to quote, when you might want to use a paraphrase, and when you might want to summarize. So let's start with quoting. So a quote uses another author's exact words inside quotation marks. When you use those quotation marks, your readers know that you did not write those words. They're coming from somebody else. So when do you use a quote? If you find wording that's especially powerful, use a quote, right? Sometimes we come across things in our research where we're like, wow, that made me see something in a new way. If you have that experience, that's the perfect opportunity to use a quote. Sometimes an author just says something better than we could. That's another perfect opportunity to use a quote. And sometimes the exact language is important. If you're quoting like a public figure, for example, and you don't want anybody to misconstrue their words, a quote is a perfect thing to give your reader exactly what was said or written. Quotes work really well for definitions, for powerful statements, for memorable language. If you stop and you're like, whoa, I probably am never going to forget that. Perfect opportunity for a quote. And then, of course, evidence you want readers to see exactly. This is especially important in today, when there's all this talk about fake news and who really said what. Sometimes somebody's exact words can say something and help your reader to understand something. So you are going to use a quote because the words matter. Now, let's talk about paraphrasing. Paraphrase puts the author's ideas into your own words while still keeping the same level of detail. Now, I do want to point out, I know we talked about this in the evaluating sources lecture, but regardless of whether or not you use a quote, a paraphrase, or a summary, you do have to cite it. Even if you take somebody else's ideas and put them in your own words, you still have to credit them for their idea. Now, the difference between a paraphrase and a summary is that a paraphrase is going to be the same level of detail. So it will be about the same length as whatever you're talking about. You want to use a paraphrase when the information is important, but maybe the exact wording is. So you're going to use your own voice to stay in control of your writing. You're going to give your reader the information that they need, but do it in your voice, your words, your writing style. So a paraphrase is best for when you are explaining evidence or integrating research smoothly. Really, anytime that you want to show that you really understand the source material, a paraphrase is a great thing to use. So just like with quotes, we're going to quote because the words matter. When we use a paraphrase, we're going to paraphrase because it is the idea that matters. Now, when do you use a summary? So a summary is essentially when you give your reader the big picture of a larger section of information. So if you only need the main point, or the details aren't necessary, or you're going to be introducing a source before you really get in there and quote it or paraphrase it, a summary is perfect. Sometimes you've read a whole article or looked at a very large study. Maybe you've read a whole book, right? You're obviously not going to paraphrase the entire book, but you might give a summary of it. Summaries are also great for background information. So, quote is when the words matter. Paraphrase is when the idea matters. And the summary is going to be when just the main idea is what matters. So, when do you use each one? If you want the exact wording, you're going to use a quote. If you want the same idea but your own words, you're going to use a paraphrase. And if your reader only needs the main point, then you are going to summarize the material. So, the question that I want you to think about before you decide is, what is it that my reader actually needs? Does my reader need to see this in the speaker's own words? Does my reader need the ideas, but in my words? Or does my reader just kind of need an overview or only the general main idea? One of the things that it's really important to do when you use research sources is make sure that you are integrating them well into your writing. A common mistake that students make is letting sources do all of the talking. This is not your work, your writing, your essays. They're not going to be like a compilated puzzle of a whole bunch of different quotes fitted together. Good research should make up 20% of your writing, and 80% of it should be your own thinking, your own ideas, what you bring to the conversation. Anybody can go out and do the same research that you did. What you have to offer is your analysis, how you have interpreted what you are putting in your paper. So that's what your readers want to hear from you, not just what other people have already said. I also think it's important to point out that research supports your argument. Research is not going to make your argument for you. Now, like I said, every source needs a citation. Whether you are quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing, if you're using somebody's words or ideas, you must include an in-text citation as well as a works cited entry. It is your responsibility as a writer to let your readers know if the ideas and words that you're using in your paper come from somewhere else. It's also important to remember that your sources are supporting characters. If you imagine your essay like a movie, you are the main character. Your sources are just supporting cast. They are not going to do the majority of the talking. They are not going to give away the big revelations. They are just there to support you. If the supporting characters do all the talking, then the audience is going to forget who the movie is really about. So your job as a writer is to stay in control of the conversation. Remember, one of the reasons that students rely too heavily on AI is because they start to think that their job is just to collect information. It really isn't. Your job is to make meaning from that information. So go out there, research your topic, collect all these great sources, and then decide what they mean and what you have to contribute to the conversation that is happening. So things like quotes, paraphrases, and summaries are just tools to help you explain your ideas, not to replace them. If you have questions, do I need to quote? Do I need to summarize? Should I paraphrase this? Are these sources cited correctly? What is, the best plan of action for research in my paper? Please reach out. I am always happy to help. Remember, I know this is an online class, but I am your real life professor, and I am here to help you meet your goals in this class.